Hello there, this is modern day Tilly here to introduce a video by past Tilly. This is a video that I filmed about 2 years ago, just after we'd moved into our new house, and in it I discuss Self-Control by Mary Brunton. So Mary Brunton is an author who is generally spoken about today as being one of Jane Austen's contemporaries and as a novelist whose works we know Jane Austen read. But I was determined to make a review that did not kind of refer to Jane Austen and only talk of her in light of Jane Austen. So what I did instead was sort of like a bit of a feminist discussion on the role of private spaces for the female heroine. So I identified 5 different functions of the private space in Self-Control, and these were artistic, religious, rational, emotional, and protective. And I believe these functions can be seen in other books from the time period. So for instance, Jane Eyre, it's slightly later, but she does have an artistic and a religious function to the way that she uses her private space. And Jane Austen's heroines generally use their spaces in rational and emotional ways in terms of like reflecting on proposals they may have received and, you know, like just generally processing their emotions and their plans for the future. And somebody like Jane Fairfax uses her room in a protective function when she's avoiding seeing visitors that she doesn't want to receive. And also the heroines of like Gothic novels, such as Mysteries of Udolpho, use their rooms to kind of try to protect themselves from the, you know, awful Gothic villains that they were confronting. So yeah, I think there are things in what I said that can apply to other works of literature. I do a little summary of the start of the plot of Self-Control, so if you don't know the book at all, there might still be something interesting in this video for you. I would definitely say that Self-Control is my favourite book from the time period that is not by Jane Austen, so I would recommend it to read. But yeah, it's peculiar in places, and so is this video, because it's from back in the day when I used very formal scripts and said everything in very stilted tones and generally didn't trip over my words so much because I edited out every single error. So yeah, I've had a little bit of a awkward time this afternoon trying to remind myself how to edit things, but I hope it's worthwhile if a couple of you kind of find it interesting, and if any of you are reading Self-Control as the prompt for Jane Austen July to find a novel by a Jane Austen contemporary, then hopefully it will contribute to your enjoyment of that. So anyway, I hope you find this interesting, and thank you very much for watching.
Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a book called Self-Control by Mary Brunton, which was published in 1810. So the theme of us having moved into our own space fits in really well with what I want to talk about today with regards to self-control. Essentially, I was going through this book thinking about how I wanted to review it and what I wanted to talk about, and it struck me just how important personal space is to the heroine Laura Montreville. And that in turn reminded me of the essay A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. It's been several years since I read A Room of One's Own, but I remember finding it a very powerful piece of writing. It's from 1929. It was written based on a series of university lectures in which Woolf discusses how important having a degree of privacy and financial independence is for the ability to write. As summarised in the well-known quote, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." Although Woolf came up with this thesis over 100 years after Self-Control was published, it's very relevant to Self-Control. In fact, that quote is echoed in the words of Sarah Maitland, who wrote the introduction to the edition that I have here, when she said that Brunton uses her book to firmly defend women's financial independence and right to hard, creative work. Laura is not a writer, but she is an artist. And she is also a character who, through much of the book, does not have access to those 2 elements that Woolf identifies as essential to women being creative. And this very clearly affects her journey through the plot. Having identified this link, I kind of got way too far into it. I got a bit carried away, and I read the book again and highlighted every single instance where Laura having a room of her own or not having that room becomes important to the story and to her character. As you can see, there are quite a few tags in this book. This video sort of grew out of that process as I identified several ways in which, to me, the room functions in the story. But first, before I get properly into this, Self-Control is not the kind of book that the casual reader of classics will have heard of, so I had better introduce it to you a little bit, I think. So, Self-Control is a little-known Regency novel. I found out about it from an online course which looked at it in terms of its influence on another far better-known writer from the period, and I thought it sounded interesting, and I was lucky enough to find a copy in my local university library, which was published by Pandora in 1986, and that was part of their Mothers of the Novel series. So they had gone through and identified a selection of authors, including Mary Brunton, who were important to the formation of the novel as we know it today, but aren't the people that we necessarily recognise. Bo just got home and he showed me how to use the white balance function of this camera, so now it looks a lot better. So, as I was saying, essentially what this book is a 19th century young adult novel. Young adult obviously wasn't a genre at the time, young adult wasn't even really a recognised phase of life, but I think that this book, which centres around the marriage plot, offers a lot of what you would expect to find in a young adult book, which is a life more exciting but less realistic than your own, played out by the kind of characters that you kind of wish you knew or you were. So in this book, like in others of a similar genre and period, the heroine is like a kind of Regency Mary Sue. In the case of Laura, she is beautiful, accomplished, pious, and also pretty badass. When she encounters problems, she takes the reins, literally at one point, and she shows a degree of self-determination which, although limited, is probably greater than a lot of her contemporaries. Like a lot of YA, this book is very fun to read. There is all the drama and all the romance, but it's also quite ridiculous in places. There is also melodrama, and it definitely gets a bit over the top, and even, dare I say it, tedious. Honestly, I think it could do with a good edit, which is something that I've thought about several novels that I've read from the period. But editing probably wasn't such a big thing back then. I don't know, there wasn't such a publishing industry as we have today. It was still very easy and very quick to read in terms of being a classic novel, and quite plot driven, which I think is another characteristic of YA books. I'm going to tell you the bare bones of the plot of Self-Control, because while I would definitely recommend this book to classics fans, I think not many people will have read it or would have the chance to read it even if they wanted to. And there's a lot of other people for whom the concept would be interesting, but they wouldn't want to actually go and read the book. And going through a little bit of the plot is really going to help clarify what I mean when I'm talking about Laura and Laura's rooms later on. So at the start of the book, Laura Montreville is living in rural Scotland with her father. In the very first chapter, her lover, who has been courting her for quite a while, gets her alone in an isolated spot, a motif which will be repeated throughout the novel, and he makes her a very scandalous proposal. And you can really see all of the bosoms heaving and the Regency readers of this book fluttering their fans in shock, but secretly this is the kind of thing that I'm sure they were all mad to read about. Laura, however, is a very religious girl, so she is shocked and distressed, and like anyone who's been deceived by someone that they love, she realises that falling out of love with this young man will be much harder than falling in love with him. And that personal struggle with her passion comes with her throughout a large portion of the novel. Her father then discovers that his financial situation is deteriorating and he has to travel to London to sort it out. And Laura has happened to overhear an artist talking about one of her paintings, and in particular commenting on its potential value and how an artist with those skills could potentially gain success selling their work in a big city. So she decides to join her father on his journey to London in the hopes that by selling her art she can contribute to their income. Once they get to London, Laura has to fight off a bit of unwanted attention, but she does eventually manage to sell some art, even while she's still heartbroken over her ex-lover. However, her father's financial situation deteriorates further. He becomes increasingly unwell and gradually they become destitute, to the point that Laura is forced to take up a dependent position in the house of a distant relative, because this is the only shelter available to her. Meanwhile, Laura's ex-lover pursues her to London and this time tries to persuade her to marry him. And despite Laura now being sure that he is what they called a libertine, she increasingly comes under pressure to accept his proposals from her relations because they will give her financial security and social status, even though she can't respect his character and couldn't respect herself if she married him. Increasingly, the young man's behaviour becomes controlling and threatening, and working in partnership with Laura's aunt, he creates a domestic environment for Laura that in modern terms can only be described as abusive. Charming to the outside world, within the house the pair of them isolate Laura and use emotional, financial and even eventually physical abuse to try to coerce her to do their bidding and in particular to marry him. I don't think I need to tell you any more other than that Laura does have another romantic interest in this book, who is a much nicer gentleman, who does promote her engaging in her interests such as chemistry and mathematics, even though these were not considered very proper things for a woman to be interested in at the time. So he promotes her freedom of mind and intellectual development. That, in a nutshell, is Self-Control by Mary Brunton. Without giving absolutely everything away, I'd hope if you did want to read this, you would still feel like there was things for you to find out within the book. So to go back to what I said about this book linking in with a room of one's own, and that idea of personal and financial freedom being a barrier preventing women from contributing to our tangible culture historically, I just started picking up on little instances and noting them down, and they kind of grew into categories until I found what I would call 5 functions of the room for Laura. By this I mean having a room allowed her the space to fulfill these aspects of her life, while not having a room of her own at other points left these aspects unfulfilled in a way that had a detrimental effect on her. For the rest of this video, I'm essentially going to tell you the functions that I identified and why I kind of picked them out, and explain what happens with them and why they are important to Laura. I'm fairly sure that some of these functions would apply to other women, both fictional and not fictional, so it would be interesting to hear if you can think of another character who would fit in with this kind of system that I've created. And I think this can be a good way of applying what Woolf said and demonstrating the hurdles that women face and have faced to either being artists or even just living their lives because of the inequality that leaves them without a private space. The first function that of course comes to mind is an artistic function. Like I said, Virginia Woolf specifically talks about a room of one's own as a requirement for writing fiction, but it's the same kind of idea of the production of art in a serious way rather than as a leisure activity or a frivolous hobby that allows Laura to use her room as a space for painting. In a way, this book contains Brunton's attempt to justify women's serious industry in the arts, despite the fact that she herself dismissed the book she had written as being unplanned, written in ignorance, and never initially meant for publication, in a letter to Joanna Bailey from 1811, in which she talks about some of the criticism that her work has received following its publication. Claims which I sincerely doubt, given the amount of effort that has clearly gone into this book. Like many female authors, Brunton published anonymously. Women at the time were not supposed to want to work and acquire recognition for their work, particularly in this social class. Some women were doing it, but it wasn't fully accepted, and at points in the book there are references to Laura worrying that as a female artist, she will be entering a sort of shady, scandalous world where she will be at some kind of moral risk. When she's penniless, she thinks that it is not narrow pride that prevents her from painting for a living, but rather that the life of an artist would expose her as a young and attractive woman to the intrusion of strangers, public observation, dangerous distinction, and unpitied neglect. So all quite negative terms that she uses. This really becomes an issue for Laura when she no longer has some financial backing and that vital room of her own. So initially, Laura's artwork is a cherished hobby, and she makes pictures and sketches of and for her friends or visits local houses to teach herself from older paintings. But as soon as her painting takes on a serious character on that trip to London, and she learns to look on it as a potential source of financial sustenance for herself and her father, it begins to require that private space. In fact, with a delightful enthusiasm, she physically runs out of the public space and into her private space to create her plan of coming to London to begin her artistic journey. Even when her plans don't work out exactly as she had hoped, while she still has this private space, she is able to continue to build on her creative aspirations and make plans to continue her artwork, such as attempting to show it at the exhibition in future. And it's made clear that her motivations for this are not to gain fame, but to sell her work to support her family. The period of her greatest artistic flourishing comes after her move to London, which is actually when she is worst off in the eyes of the world because she's living in poverty and obscurity. This time is the best for her because she has access to 2 entire rooms for herself, one of which functions as the artistic space while the other fulfills all of the other functions of the room for Laura. Her new studio, as you could call it, is nothing impressive. It's described as a small room, or rather a closet. So it's no grand, huge space that she's using for her art, but it still makes a huge difference to her time in London. In this period, Laura's art becomes so much more than a hobby to her, and she describes it to her father as a means by which she can be independent of all but her own exertions. which she sees as a highly desirable state, even though her father himself disapproves of her work, and at times she has to hide it from him or endure being called away from it to entertain him or attend to his visitors, even if they're people that she really doesn't want to see. Completing her artistic projects gives Laura a sense of merited satisfaction which we share, and she is empowered to go out and seek due recompense for her labours, even holding out for a fair price in spite of all the obstacles to her as art dealers refuse to take her work seriously. Later on in the book, Laura loses the extra space and with it her independent creativity. As she has no space to exercise her skills, her skill at painting almost disappears from the novel. Meanwhile, she is unable to ask for a fair price for labours which are much more difficult for her to endure. She is acting as a companion for a wealthy lady, so her job is essentially to amuse her aunt, which many women at the time would have been paid to do, and she only really gets a break from this work when her aunt has another visitor to entertain her. In this later endeavour, there is no privacy or creativity, and on my first read through of this book, I did ask myself why she didn't turn back to art to give her back some more of that cherished independence, but it's pretty clear that her art, she doesn't have the space for that because her art is considered by the accomplished world as a mere frivolous adornment, so she's reduced to like making sketches of her aunt as opposed to producing significant works of art. So she's not given the private space or the time that she needs to seriously work at it. Another function of the room that runs throughout the book is a religious function. The room provides Laura with a space in which to pray and to consider the spiritual rules that guide her decision making. Laura always has an internal sanctuary in religion, and at her direst moments she is always stopping to offer a prayer or dwell on religious sentiments that are, to be honest, quite incongruous to the modern reader. But at times internal sanctuary is not enough, and external sanctuary in the space of her room gives her a space in which reminds her to seek comfort in religion. That's not a very well phrased line. I am using a script quite thoroughly for this because there is just too much to say for me to just improvise it, given that I can't even remember the word for improvise off the top of my head. She needs the external sanctuary of a room where she can shut the door and remind herself this is the place where I pray and speak to God, uninterrupted, importantly. So that's the religious function of the room. Brunton herself was the wife of a Scottish minister, and religion and religious principle is quite a big deal in this novel. There is a lot of criticism of people who may be good people, but who take the scriptures lightly, and Laura's strictness in this regard is actually something that really safeguards her from all the hazards that are thrown at her, most specifically from her libertine lover, because it's due to her religious principles that she is able to persist in refusing him. This happens from the beginning of the book, when she finds hope and comfort from private prayer, right through to the end of the book, so page 421, when at the moment of her direst need she spends what she fears will be her last night on earth, and definitely her last night with a private room and any personal space, in acts of devotion, finding herself supported by the raptures of faith which triumphed over every fear, giving her the fortitude that she needs to persevere and reach the morning. This religious function isn't one that I personally want to dwell on too much, as at times I actually found the religion in this book a little bit irritating, but it is undeniably there, and Laura is definitely not the only heroine I can think of who uses the private space of her own room to seek a connection with a religious power that then gives her the resolve to act in the way that she knows she ought to act in, rather than in the way that her heart desires. Another function that I won't be dwelling on too much is what I've dubbed the rational function of the room. Essentially by this I mean that having a private space enables Laura to think through her options and make calm decisions based on what will be best for her. For example, when she first finds out about her lover's deception, she goes to her room and gives herself really the best to break up advice around of keeping busy, not talking to her ex, and hanging out more with her best friends. Unfortunately, while Laura's own room does give her the space that she needs to think these things through, in this function it is more the outside world that interferes. Laura can make rational decisions, but her status as a young dependent woman frequently prevents her from acting on them. She's forced to comply with the social norms and rules of the period, which does her a huge amount of harm. Another way in which Laura uses the rational space is for financial planning. As her poverty increases, she is able to consider which items are luxuries and which are necessities, and to plan and practice other domestic economies. When she loses the room of her own, although she is materially better off, she is less in control of her finances, and she makes some identifiably bad financial decisions. And she's basically less able to rationally process what she needs to prioritise because she doesn't have that space to herself to think about these things. And even at times, her money itself is not secure. Similar to that is the room's emotional function for Laura. Emotion and reason and the balance between them are often played out within the sphere of the private room, such as what I've mentioned about trying to get over her lover, and also things like Laura privately dealing with her grief following a death and moving on to make practical arrangements for the funeral within that space of her room. Having a private space enables her to process the many ups and downs that she faces over the course of the novel. Brunton truly embraces Laura's emotional self in this book and allows her to have strong emotions, including her overpowering love for a dangerous man. It's almost quite daring to give Laura such a strong emotional life, but it is clear that this is not a life that she can live in public. Time after time, Laura restrains herself in company and waits until she is in her own room to give in to grief, loneliness, fear and also delight. Even positive emotions must be constrained in public. In fact, when she is highly emotional but unable to escape into her own space, she generally faints, which I interpret as accessing a kind of forced privacy as well as being a common trope at the time. However, even though she controls her emotions in public and only indulges them in private, her emotional space is still intruded upon as her room is not entirely safe and secure. For example, right at the start of the book, her lover actually spies on her in her distress through her window and he thinks, never in the cheerfulest scenes had he beheld her with such delight as he did now, when every gesture seemed the expression of unutterable anguish. Which is just so very, very creepy. There is another woman in the book who has emotions even more passionate than Laura's, and she too is spied on and quite literally thrown out from her home in disgrace when she is found to not be conforming to the rules of the time. So even though this woman was a wealthy heiress, that room of her own that she was able to financially support was still under the power of her husband and relied on her emotional compliance with patriarchal social requirements. Brunton doesn't say it too forcefully, but as a reader you can definitely sense her disapprobation for a social system that punished women succumbing to their passions far more harshly than men. The final, and possibly the most important function of the room for Laura is the protective function. Many times throughout the novel, the room acts to protect Laura's health, well-being and even physical safety, while the lack of that room puts her under threat. In some cases this is about having a space in which to rest when ill, in others it's about having a refuge. In terms of her physical safety, the room is the last barrier for her on multiple occasions, her last space of respite. When she encounters difficulties such as unwished for attention from suitors, her room is a vital space which she can hide in to avoid them. It's a pretty unpleasant thought that these unpleasant and exploitative men can chill out in her living room and leave her trapped in her bedroom time and again, but at least she does have that element of privacy there. Increasingly, as it proceeds, this book becomes a very dark tale of coercion, control, manipulation and domestic abuse. We get phrases like recovered freedom and escape to describe how Laura feels in getting into her own private room. The fact that she only feels free while shut into a room is indicative of the worsening situation that she's finding herself in, particularly as the room's more developed functions, such as an artistic space, are stripped away. The room becomes Laura's one refuge, and sometimes even her own room cannot afford her the protection that she requires. In A Room of One's Own, Woolf identified that having a lock on the door to this room is a pretty key way of ensuring that it is a private space where a woman can really go to develop her ideas. But a lock is insufficient for Laura because she is a dependent relative. She is obliged to unlock the door to let in her manipulative aunt, or to leave her room to come to her aunt when she is called for. So she no longer has that personal space. On page 293, this is expressed as, "But her persecutions by Lady Pelham had no intermission. From them she had no retreat. Her chamber was no sanctuary from so familiar a friend. She has lost that private protective space, she becomes increasingly beleaguered and just stuck in this worsening situation, and she has no relief foreseeable other than to give up her personal freedom in another way, by marriage." Her aunt even locks her into her room at times, showing the extent of the control that she is exercising over Laura. Later on, in one of the most harrowing moments of the book, Laura is actually physically forced to endure her locked door being broken down and herself being nearly dragged out of the room. This is a climactic moment, and it very graphically represents the kind of physical invasions into her privacy and her personhood that her unvirtuous lover is actively contemplating and planning. Those are all of the reasons that I found why having a room of her own is important to Laura Montreville in the book Self-Control by Mary Brunton. And if you are asking yourself why I have spent many hours working out all of these functions and creating this video about a very little known book, then you are not alone. I have definitely asked myself the same question today, because finding the last few quotes and things to bring this video together has been a little bit of a headache. But I think firstly it's good and interesting to consider other books from the history of the novel that don't normally fit into the classic books canon, because a lot of these books don't deserve to be forgotten. This book was definitely very enjoyable to read. And it's also important to look at the position of women going back through history and apply later feminist ideas to them. Because as Sarah Maitland says in her introduction to my copy here, these forgotten or hidden women in history had a huge influence on who we are today. So to use her own eloquent words, fairly conventional, ordinary, middle-class women developed the intellectual concepts and emotional self-awareness that were to lead to the next generation later in the 19th century to demand and achieve real social changes in their unjust and unequal condition. Thanks to women like Mary Brunton developing characters like Laura Montreville, enabling people to question the justice of the situation as it stood then, 200 years later, at least in the country where I am living, no one questions my right as a woman to produce and publish my own creative content. I'm lucky enough to have the power of choice in that matter in a way that Laura and her contemporaries did not. Now, we could take this further. We could talk about how women in the creative industries are still often find themselves paid less than men or belittled on the grounds of their gender. We could talk about the long way there is to go for gender equality, including non-binary genders. We could talk about creative inequality in other areas, and just to mention Brunton's handling of characters from other ethnic backgrounds in Self-Control is less than charming. And we could talk about the many people, not just women, in this country and around the world who do not have that room of their own, and the detrimental way in which these voices are potentially therefore being restricted, making them less likely to be heard in our shared cultural spaces for the reasons that Woolf underlined in A Room of One's Own. But for me, for today, for Self-Control, that is enough said. So please share your thoughts with me in the comments, whatever avenue they may be running in. I'm really curious to know if anyone has stuck it out to the end of this video, and if so, what it made you think, and whether the things that I've said have any application to what you are currently reading. For me, that's the Iliad. A book in which women have almost no personal space whatsoever, so I guess Laura should really just thank her lucky stars that she wasn't born in ancient Greece. Anyway, thank you for watching. I better take these tags out of this book and get it back to the library today, so hopefully somebody else can take it out and enjoy its charms.